All right, everyone. So I want to talk to you guys about the nature of evil. What makes evil so effective, so appealing, so successful in recruiting people? What makes evil so effective is the fact that it has truth. It uses the truth. Much of the things that evil says, or that evil people say, are based on truth. They have kernels of truth. They have bits of the truth. But nonetheless, in the end, they have truth. They mix truth with lies. And so because they have that kernel of truth, because they have that degree of truth, what they say becomes believable. What they say becomes believable, and therefore what they tell you to do becomes the right thing to do. No matter how destructive it may be, no matter how destructive the actions that they're telling you to do are, they appear to be the right thing to do. There is a scene in the movie The Exorcist, and if you have not seen the film The Exorcist, you should see it. I know October just passed, but you should see the film The Exorcist. Not because I want you to be scared or anything like that, because for one thing, it's a very well done film, but another thing is that the movie has a lot of... It presents a lot of the reality of the nature of evil. So there's a scene in the film The Exorcist where Father Karras is about to participate in the exorcism of this possessed girl. And this girl is possessed with the demon of Pazuzu, who comes from ancient Iraq and is part of the Sumerian religion. And so there is Father Karras, and then there is the more mature priest. He's been doing this a long time. He's a lot older, and he has more wisdom. And the older priest tells Father Karras that the devil will mix truth with lies to attack us. He will mix truth with lies, and that the attack is very psychological. And what makes it psychological is the fact that it has truth. So Satan will use truth against us. He will use our own sins against us. He will use our own fears. He will use our own guilt against us to weaken us, to drain us of our morale and of our willpower and of our determination. And that's what makes the nature of evil so effective and so dangerous. This strategy of using the truth in order to mobilize people for a particular cause is seen in every single evil and destructive political and ideological movement in history. It is used in every single form of fascism and despotism. And it was used as a strategy to justify every single genocide and act of mass murder done in history. There isn't a single... Let me just put it this way. In history, there isn't a single genocide nor massacre that was done without the perpetrators of the crime using truth to justify themselves. You can see this in every single fascistic or murderous regime in history, and even before that. In ancient times, you can see this sort of thing. For example, the use of human sacrifice. Well, We are going to ritually sacrifice this human being to the gods, and we're also going to, I don't know, drink his blood or something like that. But this person was a criminal, and so he deserves it. There was a church father who talked about this. I think it was Tertullian, who talked about how the Romans would go to the arena or the circus to watch a woman get sodomized by a donkey. And he wrote that this woman was arrested for thievery. She was stealing something. I don't know, she stole a loaf of bread or something. And so her crime was that she had to be tied up to a pole and then sodomized by a donkey. And people would gather together to watch this because it was entertaining. And imagine what the crowd would say. If you were to, get on a time machine and go back to the ancient Roman Empire, and you were, let's say you were to confront some of the people in the crowd watching this. Why are you watching this? This is pretty disgusting. This is pretty cruel. This is pretty sick. And they would say, well, she was a thief. She was found stealing some loaves of bread, so she deserves it. Well, it is true that she was a thief, right? If that's what the courts determined, yeah, she was a thief. But does that justify her getting sodomized by a donkey? Does that justify you people watching it as entertainment? Does that justify cruelty? No. Punishment has to be proportional to the crime. But this is just an example of how the nature of evil works. For example, there's many examples that you can pick from. I'll give you an example that I have been reading about, and that is the example of Sabra and Shatila. The PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, was one of the main factions involved in the Lebanese Civil War from the mid-1970s to the 1980s. And the Lebanese Civil War lasted for quite some time, from 1975 all the way up to the year 1990. So, over 2 decades. And so it was the PLO on one side and other left-wing Palestinian factions, PFLP and others. And then on the other side, you had the fascists. You had the Phalangists, and then you also had the Haddad faction, and then you also had the Tigers, who were ran by Mr. Danny Shamoun. And these were fascists. These were right-wing Lebanese Catholic fascists. And yes, Catholics can be fascists, and I'm actually planning on doing a video on this subject. It is true that the PLO committed atrocities. It's true that the PLO massacred Catholics in the neighborhood of Damour. I was about to say Damoun. In Damour, the PLO entered the neighborhood. They had a battle with the Maronite faction. I believe it was I want to say it was the Shamoun faction, but I could be mistaken about that. But nonetheless, they were fighting the right-wing faction. The PLO won the battle. They entered the neighborhood and they killed pretty much everyone there. They raped the women, and they lined up the men against the walls, and they shot them. It was mass murder. It was horrific what happened. But then, what ended up taking place? Well, in 1982, the right-wing militants entered the Palestinian camp of Sabra, and they also entered the other camp of Shatila, and they butchered around 1,000 or so people, raped the women. These were Palestinian refugees. These weren't even members of the PLO. The PLO at that point had been forced out. There was a negotiation that was brokered by the Reagan administration with Philip Habib, and the PLO had to be pushed out. The PLO at that point were on their way to Syria and North Africa and other parts of the Middle East. And so the refugee camps, the Palestinian refugee camps of Sabra and Shatila, were without weapons. They were without any sort of gunmen. The only reason why The phalangists didn't enter the camps before is because they were, frankly, cowards, and they were afraid of having a gun battle with the PLO at the camps. The PLO, they were a paramilitary organization, and they were no joke. These guys, they could handle themselves. They could take on a street fight. They could, in several cases, they were able to fight pretty effectively against the IDF when the IDF wasn't using the Air Force and were fighting on the ground. The PLO were quite vicious in the battlefield. These guys were no joke. And so once the PLO was gone and there were no more gunmen to protect the refugee camps, the phalangists, the fascists, said, hey, easy prey, a bunch of elderly people, women and children in a refugee camp. Let's rape a bunch of women and let's indulge in sadism and bloodlust. And so the right wing went to these refugee camps and they butchered nearly, I want to say, around 1,000 or so people. Some people say it was in the thousands, but the more conservative estimates that I've seen says it was around 1,000 or so people, maybe a little bit over 1,000 people. Nonetheless, it's mass murder. For 3 days, the phalangists butchered Palestinian refugees, and it was literally the Rwandan genocide for 3 days. That's what it was, Middle Eastern style. Now, if you were to talk to the right-wing militants about this, they would say, well, the Palestinians killed Lebanese civilians. The Palestinians killed Maronites. They did the Damour massacre. They did this and they did that. And my response to that would be, well, why didn't you kill all the PLO guys? Why didn't you fight the PLO guys in that moment? Why did you wait for the PLO to leave so you can go into a camp and murder a bunch of literally elderly people, women and children? They massacred an elderly care center, and they massacred a maternity ward. That's essentially what these monsters did. Why did you rape the women? What does that have to do with justice for what happened in Damour or other events where the PLO killed Maronites? How is rape a form of justice? How is slitting the throat of elderly people justice? How is murdering infants justice? How is taking a pregnant woman and ripping her fetus from her womb justice? What does that have anything to do with what happened, with your grievances, with your plight under PLO insurgency? Nothing. It's just an excuse. It's a pretext for your own sadism and bloodlust. I can give you guys another example. Let's turn it around and talk about the PLO and the Palestinians' own hypocrisy. The Israelis have done terrible things to Palestinians. It's true, they have. They've taken Palestinian homes, they've bombed civilians, they've put settlements in Palestinian territory. Israel is not completely innocent. But at the same time, the PLO will come around and say, well, let's put some bombs in a pizzeria. Let's blow up some buses. Let's do a whole bunch of suicide bombing missions and murder civilians. I'll give you guys one particular story. Since we're talking about the Lebanese Civil War, this story is in this context. During the Lebanese Civil War, there was a situation where the Israelis were bombing a refugee camp. They were bombing one particular Palestinian camp. And so the Israelis thought, why not just send in a bunch of soldiers into the camp to take on the PLO? So they sent in dozens of IDF soldiers into this particular camp. And the IDF lost. And the PLO got around, I want to say 49 IDF POWs, Israeli POWs, prisoners of war. And the PLO took these IDF soldiers and strapped a bunch of explosives on them and told the Israeli government, if you don't release some of our prisoners, we are going to hit the detonator and blow your guys up to pieces. The Israelis complied, and they released a bunch of PLO guys. And the PLO went back to the camp And instead of releasing the Israeli soldiers, they hit that detonator button and they butchered 49 or so Israeli soldiers, blew them up to pieces. Now, the Israelis complied with the deal. They complied with the negotiation. They said, okay, we'll release the PLO guys. And they did. And then you went back and blew those guys up to pieces anyway? Well, you strapping those bombs on those guys had nothing to do with releasing prisoners. Because when the prisoners were released, you blew them up to pieces. You just had your own sadism and your own bloodlust that you wanted to satisfy. So the PLO could sit there and say, well, the Israelis did this and they did that and they did this. It's like, well, yeah, fine. Israel has done bad things. But does that justify you murdering soldiers? Does that justify you murdering children, murdering school children? I remember reading about how there was a Lebanese terrorist, I forgot his name, but he went into an Israeli elementary school and he shot up a bunch of kids, killed them. Then he fled all the way to, I want to say he fled all the way to Lebanon, fled to Lebanon and stayed there, and the Israelis could never get him. I think eventually they assassinated him, though. But he became a hero amongst a bunch of these Islamic fanatics. Well, why is he a hero? He shot a bunch of kids up. He went to Jordan, actually. He went to Jordan and he shot up and he became something of a hero amongst Islamic fundamentalists in Jordan. And in fact, there were they put him the Jordanians eventually put him in prison. I got him confused with someone else. The Jordanians put him in prison, and there was in fact some Jordanian parliamentarians who said that he should be released because he's this hero for Allah. And it's like, no, and even the king of Jordan said, no, we're not releasing this guy. He's a mass murderer. He murdered children in an elementary school. So these fundamentalists could say, well, the Israelis did this and they did that, so this guy's a hero. It's like, well, no, he's not. Because your grievances with the Israelis has nothing to do with a bunch of kids in school. But you see, people use truth to justify whatever the hell they want. That's the thing. It's so crazy. And the weirdest aspect about it is that it is such an effective strategy by which to actually seduce people into this way of thinking. It's like, well, a lot of Jews were promoting communism in Germany. And the Nazis said, well, if we don't kill all these Jews, they're just going to live in our society and just continue to promote communism and degenerate ideologies and things like that. Well, it's like, there were Jews that did promote communism, certainly not all of them, but there were Jews who did promote communism, and they promoted other subversive ideas. But nonetheless, you could point to actual incidences of Jews promoting bad ideas and communism. But does that all of a sudden justify the existence of the Nazi regime? Does that justify support for the Nazi regime? Does that justify putting people in camps, doing experiments on them, doing mass murder? The Nazis said, well, they were Poles, they were Polish terrorists who attacked German soldiers and they killed Germans. Well, there was actually a terrorist attack in which Poles took over a German radio station, and the German army had to go in there and save Germans from these evil Polish terrorists. But it turned out those Polish terrorists were actually German operatives, and it was a false flag attack. But nonetheless, at that time, it was considered to be real. And so all these Germans were like, hip, hip, hooray, let's invade Poland. Poland is our enemy. And you could, at that time, before you found out that it was a false flag attack, you could say, well, yeah, it is true. But does that justify invading a whole country and butchering millions of their people? Obviously not. But for some reason, people are seduced by this strategy. Why are people seduced by this strategy? Well, it all comes down to one thing, and that is idealism. I'm not talking about the people on top who use war and propaganda to get people to fight so that they can acquire money and resources and the resources and profit of other countries. I'm talking about the people on the bottom, the people in the general population who aren't making money out of things like this. What gets them so hyped up about whatever it is the propaganda is telling them to do? It's because of idealism. That's the only thing. Idealism, belief in an ideal, is power. If you can get people to believe in an ideal, you have power over them. I hate to say it in that way because it sounds so domineering, but it's just the blunt reality of it. You have influence over those people, undue influence over those people, excessive influence over those people. There's a scene in the movie The Siege, and if you have not seen the film The Siege, you should. I would play clips of it, but YouTube is becoming very, very strict on playing movie scenes. I used to do it all the time, but now, the last time I tried, YouTube said we can't play your video in certain countries, so I don't want that. But I'll just tell you about the scene. There's a movie called The Siege, starring Denzel Washington and Tony Shalhoub, both very good actors. There's a scene in the film where there's a Palestinian terrorist, and he's talking to this American CIA agent. And he's telling the CIA agent, he says, "You Americans think that money is power. Belief is power." And to a great extent, he is absolutely right. Now, money is power, but in what way is money power? Money is power because you can live a very comfortable lifestyle. You can, well, that's not really power. That's just your own convenience. But with money, you can have power over others. Well, how? Well, you can pay people money and you can tell them what to do. That's one aspect of it. But there's another aspect of it. Money can be actually a means to power, in that you can use money to finance certain political movements and certain propaganda strategies to get the masses on one particular side that you want them to be, ideologically, religiously, politically. So money is actually a means to greater power over the masses, because you can create propaganda, you can create certain circumstances, and really establish certain conditions for a particular political atmosphere that you want to use to transition towards a certain paradigm or to a certain political atmosphere. They call it a zeitgeist, a particular zeitgeist. And you can do that with money. In that regard, yes, money is truly power. But people will believe in a particular ideal, not necessarily for money, but just for an ideal. Like if I told you, we can get the workers or laborers to have a collective ownership over the means of production, and you won't have to be a slave any longer. You won't have to be a laborer, living check to check. You live a very comfortable life, and you won't have to be ruled over by your boss or your landlord or whatever. If people can believe in that particular idea, then you can actually mobilize a mob strong enough to kill all the bosses, to kill all the landowners and landlords, and to kill all of the people who are controlling the labor. And guess what happens? The person who mobilized that mob now rules over the mob, and now he's the elite. Him and whatever the group that he has with him, they're the elite, they're the bosses, they're running everything. And then you end up with a Vladimir Lenin type situation where tons of the peasants are starving to death because, well, the agriculture is controlled. And it's a complete nightmare. The bottom line is that people who believe in an ideal many times are actually being manipulated by people with money. So the people without the money are being manipulated by those with money, or those who are getting paid to promote a certain ideal. And so the propaganda that is utilized very effectively to get people to believe in a particular ideal is one that has lies, because in order to get people to, actually favor mob rule, they have to be drunk by some sort of a lie. Because chaos doesn't spring from truth. Chaos springs from lies and disorder. Christ said, "I am the truth." Christ is not the father of chaos. Satan is. Satan is the father of lies. So Satan is the father of chaos. But it's going to have lies, but it's going to be lies mixed with the truth. And this is what makes political movements, destructive political movements, so incredibly dangerous. For example, people who say, well, to hell with the two-party system. There's only two parties, but those guys just rule us, and we're not allowed to have a third party. We should have this other party over here. Well, that other party just wants to become a part of that two-party. It wants to be one of those two parties in the two-party system. They just want their own power. They don't care about, fighting the injustice of a two-party system or whatever they think it is or whatever they want you to perceive it as. They'll say, well, so much of the crime rate comes from the black population, so we should be supporting abortion. And yes, there are people who make these arguments. We should be supporting abortion because less black babies means less crime. Or we should be supporting balkanization and the establishment of a white ethno-state because we'll have a crimeless society without blacks. Now, what do you have there? You have a kernel of truth, and that is there is a lot of crime in black neighborhoods. Everyone concedes to this. Everyone agrees. No one's denying it. Even, people who are very liberal will agree to this. But what's the lie? The lie is, well, we'll have this white utopia. The lie is, well, it's because they're black that they act this way. It's not because of the condition of the soul. It's not because of, bad moral teaching. It's not because of disorder in the household. It's not because of fatherlessness. It's because they're just this way and there's nothing they can do about it. And there's nothing that we can do about it. We just have to get rid of them. And that's another thing. Racism. What makes racism so destructive and so effective is that it has elements of truth in it. It has propaganda that's very true. Racist will, and I'll end with this, racist will say things like, I want to be around people who look like me. I want to be around people who look like me. I'll hear people say things like this. I remember hearing an African-American guy say, well, when I'm in a restaurant and I see, or in a bar and I see a table full of blacks, I want to sit with them because I feel comfortable with people who look like me. Well, no, you're just a racist. And the thing about this idea that makes it so insane is that people will not necessarily conceive this as racism. They'll say, well, he just feels comfortable and that's just a natural state of being a human. You want to be around people who look like you. I think that this is silly and it's inadequate. In 1982, a bunch of right-wing Lebanese militants entered a Palestinian refugee camp, two Palestinian refugee camps, raped a bunch of the women, took elderly people and slit their throats, lined people up and shot them. And the Maronites were saying things like, well, our biggest enemy are the Palestinians. Our biggest enemy is the Palestinians. And in the midst of all that, they both look alike. The Palestinian looks like the Lebanese, and vice versa. So you had people who were killing others who looked like them. Anyway, the nature of evil will always use the truth, because at the end of the day, it's the truth that we are seeking, but because of our warped perceptions and because of our warped mentalities and our the disorder that exists within us, we will seek a corruption of the truth. Because we are corrupt as humans. We are flawed. And because we are flawed, we will fall for lies. Lies in the form of utopias. And because we're so seduced by utopianism, and we're so seduced by idealism, we fall right for it. We fall right for it. But we always have to remember that every lie is mixed with truth. Because without that kernel of truth, the lie is not effective, and the lie cannot deceive you. Anyway, I've talked long enough. You guys just heard some theology. God bless.